Okay, today we are going to be going through our Causes of the Civil War guided notes. What you're going to want to have, excuse me for my voice, I apologize. What you're going to want to have out and ready for this is your Unit 12 I Know sheet. If you scroll down in Google Classroom, you should find that, and you're going to want to try filling out some of this information on your I Know sheet as we go through it. Keep in mind that your Unit 12 test will be coming up shortly, so just be aware of that. Leading to a civil war. So that's really our topic for today, as we've been talking about why does the Civil War start and kind of going through all the different reasons. And we're going to go a little bit more in depth with that here today. Antebellum is a word that I want you to understand as we go through this today as well. Some of you may have heard of the musical group before, Lady Antebellum. Antebellum literally means the time period before war. So the musical group Lady Antebellum literally means lady time before war. So that's what we're talking about today, is the antebellum period in the United States and what all that looked like. Slavery, of course, as we've been discussing, is kind of the core issue of the Civil War. It is not the only cause, but it's probably the single biggest piece of why the North and the South are going to fight each other. Northerners argued that it was cruel, it was immoral to treat other human beings in such a way. In other words, it's just flat out wrong. Southerners argued it was a necessary component in helping to farm and make money for a profitable economy. The Southern perspective was, we're making lots of money, so we're not going to stop doing what we're doing, even if it is cruel. The South's rationale, their belief system about slavery, was that African Americans were inferior and therefore needed direction, and therefore it was okay to hold them as slaves. A lot of people would say that they were just trying to justify their own reasons for doing immoral things, but that was kind of what the South was trying to say. Was there another way to solve this issue, in your opinion, or do you think war was inevitable? In other words, could the United States have somehow come to a compromise over this issue, or was this just something that it was eventually going to come to blows, it was eventually going to come to a war? Do you think that the South decided to leave, or do you think the North tells them that they must outlaw slavery? Just curious what you all think. You don't have to write your answer down, but I just want you kind of thinking about your answer. In other words, whose fault do you think this is? Who kind of tips the scales here and says, well, we're going to start this war? Let's talk about some of those reasons. The word secession is what we're talking about here. It means to withdraw formally from a union or alliance. In other words, to break away from something. If I secede from a group, I am removing myself from that group. I am no longer wanting to be involved as part of that team or that organization. What Southern states did is they nullified, meaning they canceled their ratification of the U.S. Constitution. So Southern states essentially told the North, look, we don't believe in the Constitution anymore. We don't believe what you have going on in the country anymore. We don't want to be a part of it, and we're breaking away. So the answer to the question down here is, yes, it was the South that decides to leave, and they really break away from the North. What I want you to understand is there's no single event that leads to the Civil War. There were just collectively a bunch of reasons that helped cause it. Kind of, if you ever see a fight break out, could be between you and your sibling, could be between kids at lunchtime, even friends at lunchtime. Sometimes there's not one specific reason for it, but it's a whole host and a series of different things that kind of compound and build upon one another that eventually lead to people being frustrated, people being angry, and sometimes people going to blows or people actually fighting, which is the case in what we're talking about here. Last term on this slide for you is going to be fire eater. This isn't someone at a circus, okay, although it kind of reminds me of that. A fire eater is an outspoken advocate of Southern rights and Southern independence. In other words, somebody in the South who was very pro-Southern rights. They wanted to go against the North. They wanted to do their own thing. Fire eaters kept saying things like the South could leave the United States, could leave the Union, and could stand on their own. And there was a growing thought throughout the Southern states that what do we need the North for? We don't need to be part of this United States. We don't need to be part of the Union. We can go just do our own thing. We're very different in the way we think anyway. So there were a variety of things that people tried to get to work. One is going to be called political sectionalism. So basically, we politically tried to keep everybody happy. Now, as often happens when you try to keep everybody happy, you keep nobody happy. So over this whole issue of slavery, the first way that we as a nation tried to address it is what's called the Missouri Compromise. This is proposed by a guy you might remember from our Andrew Jackson unit, Henry Clay. Remember, Clay and Jackson were mortal enemies. But Henry Clay's idea of keeping the peace between the North and the South was that for every slave state, we had to have a free state. For every free state, we had to have a slave state. And for the longest time, we wanted to keep this balance as a nation to make sure that slaveholding states had the same power as non-slaveholding states. So in other words, whether you were a northern state or a southern state, we wanted to keep that balance of power very equal within our country. So under the Missouri Compromise, Missouri in 1820 enters the United States as a slave state. And again, for every slave state, you have to have a free state. For every free state, you have to have a slave state. So when Missouri entered as a slave, obviously we need to have a free state that entered as well. And in this particular case, it was Maine. And for 30 years, that's really what we did in this country. When Michigan became a state, I believe it was Arkansas around that same time, that became a slave state. Michigan, obviously, a free state. For every free state, you have to have a slave state, and vice versa. So Michigan and Arkansas entered about the same time to keep that balance of power between slave and non-slave. There's also an invisible line at 36 degrees, 30 minutes, basically saying no slavery allowed north of this line. Think of like that line that we talked about in the Underground Railroad movie, where you have the Ohio River kind of being that section of north of there is freedom, south of there is slavery. That's kind of where that line was. Now, for 30 years, from 1820 to 1850, this really worked. But it didn't work in 1850 because if you remember from the California Gold Rush that we've discussed so far this year, California is going to become a free state. And as goes with the Missouri Compromise, if there's a free state, you got to have you guessed it, a slave state. The problem was the United States wanted to add California. However, California at the time had no slave state to go with it, no real prospective slave states. Therefore, the United States government says, well, we better give something to slave-holding states or they're going to be upset that we admitted a free state. So what they do is they incorporate this strict fugitive slave law, which we've talked about in the past. This is where, in 1850, now any slave north of the Mississippi, any slave at all in the United States, whether they're north of the Ohio River or not, if they're an escaped slave, they need to be brought back down into a state of slavery. This is, of course, where we talked about with the Underground Railroad. Slaves could no longer get north of the Ohio River and be free. Now they need to get to Canada to be free. The other compromise made for the southern states is that voters in western territories, New Mexico and Utah, would decide the issue of slavery amongst themselves. In my opinion, this was the United States' way of saying, we don't want to decide because we don't want you guys to get mad at us. So you know what? You decide. We'll put you in charge. You make your own way here. And for the most part, Americans hoped this would end the issue of slavery. Is by just saying, all right, California gets this. Free states, you get a new state. Slave states, you get this new slave law. We're going to let territories decide for themselves, and we're going to hope this kind of ends it. Do you think these solutions are going to work in the long run? I can already tell you're probably sitting there going, no. Sounds like it's just creating more problems. Again, when you try to please everybody, oftentimes you please no one. Slave and free territories. This is going to look a little bit like the slave and free states map that you created earlier this unit. In green, those are all the free states and free territories. In yellow, the slave states and territories. And then in purple here, these are where the decision was left to the territories. It's an idea called popular sovereignty, which means the people decide. So you can kind of see in 1850, before this Civil War starts in another 10 years, this is kind of how things looked. I often get students that say, well, how big is the deal with slavery really in the South? Like, how much did it impact society? The numbers you see here, the percentages, that's slaves as a percentage of the total population. So I want to really bring your attention to Mississippi. 51% of the human beings in Mississippi were slaves. 57.5% of people living in South Carolina were slaves, which means there were more black slaves in these two states than there were free white people. So to say that some of these states down in this region of the country relied on slavery a little bit is a way gross understatement. Slavery was a way of life. This is how people did business. This is almost half of the people living in these communities are black slaves. And so you can imagine if South Carolina has to let over half their people free, it's going to have a huge impact on their culture, their economy, and everything else. You can see some of the more northern slave states, your Missouris, your Kentucky, your Virginia, your Maryland, your Delaware. Yes, slavery exists there, but not nearly the percentages that make up the far southern states. So you get the idea of really how things are split regionally in this country in terms of slavery and just how big a deal it was in certain parts of the southern region. Aren't you glad you don't have to take notes on this? You should be. Events leading to the secession of the South, the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854 does the same thing that we were trying to do with territories in the past. It basically organized as two territories, one Kansas, the other being Nebraska, and the United States government essentially says that popular sovereignty, in other words, the people will decide the issue of slavery. So this is the government's way of saying, we're not going to decide, we'll make you do it. And one of the issues with this is no one in the government said, well, what's the deadline for this? When does it have to happen? When do we have to know what people are going to do? So it was very ambiguous. There was a question of, well, when does this have to be decided? Is there a deadline? And there really wasn't. So that was a problem because people didn't know, well, when do we have to know by? Instead, what happens as a result is a lot of fighting. In what becomes known as Bleeding Kansas, in this 7-year time frame, 1854 to 1861, we saw many supporters of slavery and abolitionists, so people who love slavery, people who hate slavery, fighting one another. And it's estimated somewhere between 50 to over 200 people were killed. What that means is you have people fighting for slavery, people fighting for no slavery, and they're trying to figure out what their territory is going to look like. This guy right here, John Brown, was one of the leading abolitionists that helped lead the fight. I'm going to attach these to Google Classroom as well. And I want you to read these stories and especially watch this YouTube video just so you can have an idea of how big an issue was slavery. Were people actually fighting about it? This story of the caning of Charles Sumner, spoiler alert, so I'll make sure you watch it. A senator actually gets hit in the head with a cane all over this idea of the debate of is there going to be slavery or is there not? Another main cause of this Civil War is going to be what's called the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott is this guy right here. I can give you his story. In 1857, Dred Scott was a slave. He had lived in a free territory with his master. Now, territories were kind of the wild, wild west in that there weren't necessarily established rules or laws out there. So when Dred Scott was living out there with his master and his master died, Dred Scott says, my master's dead. I'm in a free territory. That must mean I'm a free man. And of course, people who were pro-slavery didn't like that. People who were abolitionists who didn't like slavery thought that Dred Scott was absolutely correct. And the decision of is he slave or is he free goes all the way to the United States Supreme Court. It's going to sound crazy by today's world, but the Supreme Court in the 1850s ruled the following. Slaves are property. Congress could not ban slavery from the territories. And not only does Dred Scott lose his case 7-2, Dred Scott is sold back into slavery. Imagine how you'd feel if you were Dred Scott. You've lived your whole life as a slave, and now you finally have this feeling that I finally am going to make it. I'm finally going to get an opportunity. And of course, you can't. It really ruled the fact that black Americans were now not citizens of this country, and then therefore they have no rights. Imagine again just the feelings he must have felt, the anger. It also says that the Missouri Compromise is unconstitutional. In other words, you can't ban slavery in territories. As you might suspect, depending on what part of the country you were in, this led people to have very different feelings. In the North, people were unhappy. People couldn't believe that Dred Scott was sold back into slavery. In the South, people were elated because it meant that slaves did not have any legal rights. But what it does is leads to a lot more tension. There were different philosophies, among the two sides of the United States. One is the North's philosophy. The North began really trying to openly fight against slavery. Of course, they were a very pro-factory society, very anti-slavery, and they really believed the national government should be more powerful than the states. We've talked about this in past units, just these differences philosophically between these regions of the country. In the South, on the other hand, wanted politicians that were based on pro-agriculture and plantations, who would protect the rights of slaveholders, and they really believed more in what's called states' rights, which is that states should have more of a say than the national government, and that states should look out for their own best interest. What are your thoughts? Do you think this school of thought and this school of thought can coexist? It's like putting two politicians against one another that are so different. It's going to be hard to come to a compromise, and it really was in this case too. One of the more interesting slides I'm going to show you. Some of you might be wondering, Mr. B, when are you going to talk about Abraham Lincoln? Right now, and probably now until the rest of the school year. The Republican Party becoming a thing in the United States was a huge component of this whole Civil War. Republican Party, which starts around this same mid-1800s time frame, is the anti-slavery party in the United States. That was one of their biggest collective things that they agreed on from the very beginning as a party was, we don't want slavery in this country and we want to get rid of it. As the presidential election of 1860 drew closer, there were four main candidates. So a little different in today's landscape where typically only two people stand a realistic chance of being elected president. In this case, there were four. Abe Lincoln, the Republican, Stephen Douglas, the Northern Democrat, John Bell, the Constitutional Union Party, and a guy named John Breckinridge, who was a Southern Democrat. This won't surprise you, but Abraham Lincoln wins the election of 1860, so therefore he'll become president. He wins the election because he carries the Northern vote. What's an absolutely crazy statistic when you hear about it, Lincoln doesn't even appear on the ballot in 11 Southern states. He's, of course, against slavery, so why don't you think they put him on the ballot? Answer's pretty easy. Dude didn't like slavery. Southern people loved it. They didn't even put his name on the ballot. Even if you wanted to vote for Lincoln in the southern part of the United States, you couldn't. Now, you might be sitting there going, Mr. B, that's illegal. Sure is. You can't just take someone's name off a ballot because you don't like them. You have to put their name on the ballot. Yet 11 southern states said, we're not doing it. We can't stand Lincoln. Think about how you'd feel if you were Abraham Lincoln. You were elected president of the United States, but 11 of your states wouldn't even put your name on the ballot because they hate you that much. Not exactly an easy time that Abraham Lincoln was going to have coming into office. Because Lincoln's elected, the South's ticked off. They're furious. On December 20th, 1860, the state of South Carolina is the first southern state to secede, meaning they're going to leave the United States. Essentially, they're afraid that Abraham Lincoln's going to try to get rid of slavery. They don't want that. And so they basically state, we're going to go do our own thing. We're not going to be part of your country anymore. and we're going to go create our own. Southern states believed that because states had rights, they had the right to leave if they wanted to. If you're curious, did everybody in South Carolina feel that way? I love showing the statistic. Legislators, government workers in South Carolina voted 169-0 in favor of secession. This is a giant middle finger to the U.S. government saying, we hate you, all of us hate you, we're out, see ya. Southerners claimed that the northern Yankees, the northern states wouldn't fight, and they also thought there wouldn't be many casualties if a war did come. My, were they mistaken. This is going to illustrate a little more to you about the election of 1860. Those states in purple, Oregon, California, and all of these states, these are the electoral votes that are won by Abraham Lincoln. Again, all you have to have in our country is the majority of electoral votes, which Abraham Lincoln did win. If you add up these three numbers, they do not equal close to 180. So Lincoln wins the Electoral College, yet 11 southern states, these down here, name's not even on the ballot. When you look at popular vote, less than 40% of American citizens, when you combine the North and the South, less than 40% of human beings in this country voted for Abraham Lincoln. So by today's standards, he's one of our more popular presidents we've ever had. Not the case in the election of 1860s. You can see how the rest of it was broken down, but Lincoln got by far the most electoral votes, the majority, which is why he becomes president. So to answer this question down here, in today's society, he's obviously one of our most famous presidents ever. He's on the pennies on the $5 bill. How could he get less than 50% of the vote? Well, when less than half the country, supports him, when 11 states say, we're not doing anything, we're not even going to put your name on the ballot, it's going to make it hard for Lincoln to be successful. When you look at this slide, these new states that were formed in purple and in green, the purple and green states all became what is now called the Confederate States of America. The ones in purple left first. I'm asking you why. As you pause to think about that, think back to one of our earlier slides. Where did slavery exist the most in the United States? Right here. Who had the most to lose if Lincoln freed the slaves? Right here. Therefore, we see these states really getting the first opportunity to say, we don't want to be part of your country anymore. From there, the states in green, Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia, they also all seceded, meaning they broke away from the United States. It just takes them a little bit longer. The states in yellow, which is Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, Maryland, and I'll tell you about West Virginia. Virginia used to be this entire state right here, which is now Virginia and West Virginia, but the people in the western part of Virginia eventually said, we still want to be part of the United States. And so they broke away from Virginia during the actual war and became the state of West Virginia. Something to keep in mind, all these yellow states still had slaves throughout the Civil War. You might ask, why didn't they join up with the South? I'll ask you this. Who would have been the first states invaded had these states gone with the South? Kentucky would have been, Missouri would have been, what's now West Virginia would have been, Maryland, Delaware would have been attacked. And with them not having as many slaves, they're like, we're not doing this. We're not going to fight the United States. So these 11 southern states, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas become the Confederate States of America. They were individual states first, but then they did unite as a confederacy. As I mentioned on the last slide, 4 states decided to stay with the Union that were slave states: Kentucky, Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, and of course, I had told you already about West Virginia. President Lincoln was elated. He was so happy that Kentucky chose to stay. Well, I want you to look at the geography of Kentucky. At the time, it was basically in the central part of the United States. Some of Lincoln's quotes about Kentucky, I hope to have God on my side, but I must have Kentucky. I think to lose Kentucky is nearly the same as to lose the whole game. Kentucky gone, we can't hold Missouri nor Maryland. These all against us, and the job on our hands is too large for us. We would as well consent to separation at once, including the surrender of the capital. Lincoln truly felt that had he lost Kentucky, it would have given the South more room, more power, maybe more of these other states. But the fact that Kentucky stays with the Union, it was huge. And Lincoln doesn't free the slaves initially because he doesn't want to anger these people from Kentucky. He's afraid that they'll leave if he does. Not only did this new group of 11 states have their own name, the Confederate States of America, they also elected their own president, a man named Jefferson Davis, who we'll talk more about in our next unit. What we see happening here is the beginning of a civil war. So you understand terminology. A civil war is a war within a country. It's not between different countries. It's a country imploding from the inside, a country splitting amongst itself. Before the Civil War, people looked at our nation as very separated, as a group of states, not all that united. Eventually, post-Civil War, we are now looked at as more of a cohesive, together country. But at this point in American history, we were anything but. Again, make sure, please, that you're adding this stuff into your Unit 12 I Know sheet, and that should be really beneficial for you as we get closer to the Civil War unit. If you have any questions, please make sure you're emailing me, and I will try to get back to them at my earliest convenience. Have a great day.